The crack of the auctioneer's gavel silenced the murmuring crowd. Sold. Laughter rippled through the gathered townspeople as Elijah signed the marriage certificate with a steady hand, ignoring the whispers about the size of his new bride. Only the banker's narrowed eyes suggested something more dangerous than mockery. When the woman, Maggie, finally spoke, her quiet words carried to Elijah alone. "If they find me, they'll kill us both." Elijah. Mason stared at the cracked earth where his well had run dry, counting the days until starvation would force him from his land. 3 weeks. If he stretched what little remained in his pantry, maybe less. The Montana sun beat down mercilessly, as it had for nearly 5 months without significant rain, turning the once promising soil to dust beneath his worn boots. He walked his property with the methodical gait of a man performing a funeral march, tallying losses instead of blessings. The withered cornfield that would yield nothing this year, the empty pasture where a small herd of cattle had grazed just 2 seasons ago, and finally, the fresh mound of earth on the north side of the barn, Lucy, his last milk cow, dead from a wasting disease that had swept through the region's weakened livestock. "Should have sold you before you got sick," he muttered to the grave, though there was no reproach in his voice, just the hollow acknowledgement that sentiment had trumped sense. Lucy had been his mother's favorite, the last living connection to the family he'd buried on the hill 3 years prior. Typhoid didn't discriminate between the worthy and the worthless. In town, Elijah endured the ritual humiliation of requesting credit at the general store. Mrs. Holloway's pitying smile cut deeper than an outright refusal would have. "Just flour and salt this time, Mr. Mason?" she asked, as if he might have a hidden list of luxuries he was too proud to request. "That'll do," he answered, his voice rusty from disuse. When had he last spoken aloud? 3 days ago, perhaps, when he'd cursed the cloudless sky. The merciful transaction was interrupted by the bank door opening across the street. Harrison Wells emerged, his suit impossibly crisp despite the heat, his eyes finding Elijah with the precision of a predator sighting wounded prey. "Mason," Wells called, crossing to the general store's porch. "Been meaning to speak with you. That property of yours, prime location for the rail spur they're planning next spring." "Not selling," Elijah said, the same response he'd given 6 times since May. Wells smiled thinly. "At some point, the bank makes these decisions, not sentiment. You're 3 payments behind, and drought's not lifting any time soon." He gestured toward the parched street. "Be reasonable. Take an offer while you can still name a price." Elijah shouldered his meager supplies and stepped off the porch, ignoring the threat wrapped in financial advice. His land was all he had left. He'd die on it before signing it away to Wells and his railroad investors. The walk home stretched longer than usual, the sun hammering his shoulders like judgment. Calculations ran through his mind like desperate prayers. How long until the last preserves were gone? How many days until weakness would make work impossible? How much his remaining tools might fetch if sold? As he crested the final rise overlooking his cabin, a sudden cloudburst darkened the western sky. Hope surged briefly until the rain fell visibly in the distance, missing his land entirely. Not even a drop to tease his thirst, just mud elsewhere, while his soil remained cracked and barren. Inside his cabin, Elijah carefully measured flour into his dwindling supply bin and sat at the rough-hewn table his father had built. The empty chair across from him seemed to mock his solitude. His mother should have been there, fussing over supper, His father should have been stomping mud from his boots at the door. Instead, there was only silence and the harsh mathematics of survival. The unexpected sound of wagon wheels pulled him from his grim calculations. Visitors were rare, especially with nothing to offer in hospitality. Through the window, he recognized Silas Jenkins' traveling merchant wagon approaching, a monthly circuit that usually bypassed properties with nothing to trade. Elijah stepped onto his porch, curiosity temporarily displacing despair. Perhaps Jenkins had news worth hearing, if not goods worth buying. Either way, it was the first disruption to his isolation in weeks. And as the merchant's voice called a greeting, Elijah couldn't know that this arrival would change everything, that the proposition Jenkins carried would be either his salvation or the final surrender of what little dignity remained to him. "Got a peculiar situation might interest a man in your position?" Silas Jenkins said, accepting the cup of water Elijah offered, his last hospitality to give. The merchant sat on the porch steps, respecting the unspoken boundary of a man's home when he had nothing to offer inside. "Not buying anything," Elijah replied, the familiar phrase worn smooth from repetition. Jenkins waved away the comment. "Not selling today, delivering news." He took a careful sip, savoring the water like the precious commodity it had become. "There's a woman arrived on yesterday's stage, Wisconsin, originally looking for an arrangement." Arrangement? Something in Jenkins's tone raised Elijah's suspicions. "Marriage?" "Of sorts." Jenkins studied Elijah's reaction. "She's offering a deal, herself as wife in exchange for a good milk cow. Jersey, by the looks of it. Fine animal." Elijah's laugh was sharp and humorless. "What's wrong with her that she's trading herself for livestock?" Jenkins shrugged. "She's not much to look at, heavy-set, plain-faced, but seems educated, speaks well, has some knowledge of dairy farming." He paused. "Town's already calling her the fat widow behind her back. But that cow's worth more than most men in these parts could offer in cash." The mention of a milk cow silenced Elijah's immediate rejection. With Lucy gone, winter would be lean beyond endurance. A good Jersey could mean survival. "Why's she looking for a husband this way?" Elijah asked, unable to keep suspicion from his voice. "Didn't ask," Jenkins replied. "Some women have reasons to leave their pasts behind." "Same as some men." His eyes flickered briefly to the family graves visible on the North Hill. That night, Elijah lay sleepless, calculating worth against dignity. By dawn, desperation had made his decision. A cow meant milk, butter, cheese, salvation in the form of a living asset that could reproduce. As for the woman, he had an extra room and little expectation. The next day in town, Elijah caught his first glimpse of Margaret Wilkes through the general store window. She sat with rigid posture despite her substantial frame, sorting through a small trunk of possessions. Her hands moved with efficient precision, square-palmed and capable. Not beautiful hands, but useful ones. When she glanced up, her eyes were alert and intelligent, her expression guarded but dignified despite the whispers around her. The wedding, if it could be called that, took place that afternoon outside the general store. The traveling preacher performed the brief ceremony with professional detachment. Scattered townspeople watched with poorly concealed amusement, whispering behind hands as vows were exchanged for a cow. Harrison Wells observed from the bank steps, his expression calculating rather than amused. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher concluded without warmth. No kiss was exchanged, just a businesslike handshake as Elijah helped his new bride into the wagon. The promised cow was indeed a fine Jersey, already producing milk according to Jenkins. The animal followed placidly behind the wagon as they left town. The only sound in their awkward procession, the gentle lowing as the cow adjusted to the unfamiliar trail. 5 miles passed in silence before Maggie spoke, her voice steady and practical. "She'll need special feed," she said, nodding toward the cow, "to keep her milk rich through winter." Elijah glanced sideways, surprised by both the broken silence and the confident knowledge. "Don't have much to feed her. I know ways to stretch what you have," she replied. "My father had dairy cattle in Wisconsin. I managed them when he took ill." They lapsed back into silence until the cabin came into view. Elijah felt a flush of shame at its weathered appearance, the obvious signs of poverty and struggle. Maggie, however, studied it with practical assessment rather than disappointment. "It'll do," she said simply. Inside. Elijah showed her the spare room, his parents' bedroom, untouched since their passing. "You can have this," he said awkwardly. "I'll sleep in the main room." Maggie nodded, setting down her small trunk and the leather-bound book she'd carried in her arms throughout the journey. She didn't smile or offer thanks, just as he hadn't apologized for the room's Spartan furnishings. This was business, not courtesy. That night, after a simple meal of cornbread and the first fresh milk in weeks, Elijah stepped onto the porch to give his new wife privacy. When he heard the decisive click of the lock behind him, he spread his blanket beneath the stars with odd relief. Clear boundaries suited him fine. This was a transaction, not a marriage in any real sense. As he drifted toward sleep, a flicker of movement caught his eye on the distant ridge, a lantern where no lantern should be. Someone was watching the homestead, someone who'd followed them from town. Sleep would not come easily tonight, nor any night until he knew what kind of trouble his new wife might have brought to his door. Morning arrived with uncomfortable awareness of new presence in Elijah's home. He'd risen before dawn, habit driving him to chores, despite knowing most were futile in the drought. The cow, he should give her a name, he supposed, lowed softly from the barn where he'd settled her the night before. At least one living thing on his property would eat today. Maggie emerged from the bedroom as he returned with a pail of fresh milk, her hair already neatly pinned. Dress simple but clean. No words of greeting passed between them, just a practical nod as she took the pail from him and examined its contents with a critical eye. "Good yield," she commented, setting it on the table. "She's healthy, despite the journey." "You know cattle?" Elijah asked, watching as she moved with surprising efficiency through his kitchen, finding utensils as if she'd lived there for months rather than hours. "Raised with them," she replied, skimming cream already. "My father's herd supplied 3 counties with dairy before—" She stopped abruptly, turning her attention back to the milk. The silence stretched between them, neither willing to probe the unfinished sentence. Instead, Elijah gestured vaguely around the cabin. "Need to know what you expect from this arrangement." Maggie's hands stilled momentarily. "A roof. Safety." Her eyes met his directly for the first time. "I don't expect the privileges of a true wife, if that's your concern." Relief and something like disappointment mingled uncomfortably in Elijah's chest. "That's sensible," he managed. "And you?" she asked, resuming her work. "What do you expect beyond the cow?" "Help with the place," he said, the words coming easier now that boundaries were established. "Can't pay for labor, can barely feed myself, truth be told." Maggie nodded, unsurprised. "I can work, and I know ways to make food stretch through lean times." She glanced toward the window where his failed fields were visible. "Your soil's not dead, just dormant. There are methods to coax life back, even with little water." Elijah raised an eyebrow, skeptical but desperate enough to listen, such as, that afternoon found them in the fields. Maggie kneeling to examine the parched earth while Elijah watched with guarded hope. She sketched a diagram in the dirt with her finger, crop rotation patterns he'd never seen before. "Plant these close together," she explained, indicating sections of the crude map. "They'll shade each other, reduce water loss. And here," she pointed to another area, "legumes to fix nitrogen in the soil." "Where'd you learn this?" he asked, genuinely curious. Instead of answering, she reached for the leather journal she'd brought with her, opening it carefully to reveal pages of meticulous notes and diagrams. "My father's research, 20 years of farming in difficult conditions." Elijah studied the neat handwriting and detailed illustrations with newfound respect. The woman might be plain and strange, but she brought more than just a cow to their bargain. By evening, they'd established a careful routine, separate tasks that occasionally intersected, brief consultations about the property, and silent meals where the only sound was the scrape of utensils against plates. Not comfortable, but workable. A business partnership with clear divisions. After supper, Maggie surprised him by producing a small crock of butter she'd made while he repaired fencing. "First profits," she said simply, setting it between them. "We can sell it in Coopersville next week instead of Grant's Crossing. Better prices there." Elijah nodded, recognizing the strategy. A different town meant fewer prying eyes, fewer questions about their unusual arrangement. Agreed. As dusk settled, Maggie retreated to her room while Elijah took his blanket to the porch. The night was clear, stars emerging in fierce brilliance against the darkening sky. From this position, he could watch both the road and the ridge where he'd seen movement the previous night. Sure enough, as full darkness fell, the distant flicker appeared again, a lantern carefully shielded but still visible to watchful eyes. Someone maintaining a vigil over his property, someone patient enough to wait and observe. Elijah shifted his rifle closer, not aiming, but prepared. Whatever Maggie Wilkes was running from, whatever secrets she kept locked behind that bedroom door, they'd followed her here. The cow might save him from starvation, but her presence might invite dangers he couldn't yet calculate. Inside, he heard the soft click of the lock turning. The sound was oddly reassuring. At least one door in his life remained firmly secured, one boundary clearly drawn. Whatever complications tomorrow might bring, tonight's arrangements were settled, she with her secrets, he with his vigilance, and unknown watchers in the darkness beyond. A week passed in careful negotiation of space and routine. Elijah woke each morning to find Maggie already moving quietly through the kitchen. The cow milked, breakfast started. They worked separately, but in parallel, he repairing long-neglected fences and structures, while she implemented small changes to their food stores and the cow's care that yielded immediate improvements. The first unexpected shift in their carefully maintained distance came when Elijah sliced his palm while replacing rotted boards on the well housing. Blood flowed freely, the cut deep enough to hamper his grip. Cursing, he headed toward the barn for rags to bind it when Maggie intercepted him, eyes assessing the injury with clinical precision. "Inside," she directed, her tone leaving no room for argument. "That needs proper cleaning." In the cabin, she worked with efficient movements, washing the wound with water she'd boiled with herbs he didn't recognize. Her hands were surprisingly gentle despite their strength, turning his larger hand in hers as she examined the cut. "You'll need stitches," she said, reaching for her trunk and withdrawing a small kit. At his raised eyebrow, she added, "I've done this before." "Seems there's much you've done before," Elijah observed as she threaded a needle. Something like humor flickered across her face. Necessary skills for a farmer's daughter. She held his hand steady. "This will hurt." It did, but less than expected under her capable attention. 3 neat stitches closed the wound, followed by a salve that smelled of pine and something earthier. "Thank you," he said, the words awkward on his tongue after months of speaking to no one. Maggie simply nodded, packing away her supplies. Can't run a farm with a festering hand. Practical as always, no sentiment, just necessity. Yet something had shifted between them, a small crack in the careful distance they maintained. That evening, Elijah found himself watching her as she worked through his account books at the table, her brow furrowed in concentration. He'd mentioned the difficulty of tracking his dwindling resources with his injured hand, and she'd offered to help, revealing yet another unexpected skill. "These numbers aren't right," she said eventually, looking up from the column of figures. "You've been undercharged for your last seed purchase." Elijah moved to look over her shoulder, surprised. "Thought Wells was doing me a kindness with credit." "Not kindness," Maggie replied, pointing to entries across several pages. "He's recording false payments, building a case for default while appearing generous." Her finger traced a pattern in the numbers that made his stomach clench. "You're closer to foreclosure than you realize." The implications settled heavily between them. Wells wanted his land, had been maneuvering for it while smiling to his face. The revelation should have crushed what little hope remained. But instead, Elijah felt a flare of defiance. Having someone else see the deception somehow made it easier to fight. "Thank you," he said again, the words coming easier this time, "for seeing what I missed." Maggie closed the ledger. "I've experience with men who hide their true intentions behind smiles and figures." Something dark flickered behind her eyes, quickly shuttered away. Their moment of connection was interrupted by the sudden crack of thunder directly overhead. Within seconds, rain hammered against the roof, not the gentle soaking the land needed, but a violent deluge threatening the repairs he'd only just completed. "The cow," Maggie said, rising quickly. "The barn roof." "Stay here," Elijah ordered, grabbing his coat. "I'll check." But she was already reaching for her shawl. 2 hands work faster than one injured one. The argument died as another thunderclap shook the cabin. Together they raced through the downpour to the barn, where water already streamed through the patched roof onto the nervous cow. Working silently in practiced coordination, they moved the animal to a dry corner and positioned buckets to catch the worst leaks. With the immediate crisis addressed, they found themselves trapped by the intensifying storm, thunder rolling continuously overhead. Each flash of lightning illuminated Maggie's face in stark relief, and Elijah noticed how she flinched at the louder cracks. Her composure momentarily fractured. "Should wait it out," he said, settling on a hay bale, careful to leave space between them. Maggie nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter despite the warm evening. Another thunderclap shook the barn, and her shoulders hunched involuntarily. "Storms bother you," he observed. She glanced at him, then away. "Not the storm itself," she said quietly. "The sound reminds me of something else." The half-confession hung between them, neither pushing for more. By lightning flashes, he noticed her flinching at each thunderclap, and realized they might share more than a house. They might share the same kind of scars, though hers were hidden and his were not. When the storm finally subsided enough to return to the cabin, Maggie hesitated at her bedroom door, conflict visible on her face. "The porch will be soaked through," she said finally. "You can sleep by the hearth tonight." It wasn't much of an offer, but from her, it represented a significant concession. That night, though the bedroom door remained closed, Elijah felt the first tentative thawing of the frozen ground between them, a small space where trust might eventually grow, if carefully tended. Maggie rose before dawn, anxiety tightening her chest. Market day. The first true test of their arrangement and her first public appearance as Elijah Mason's wife. She touched the high collar of her dress, ensuring it covered the worst of her scars, then pinned her hair severely back. No amount of preparation could disguise her size or plain features. But dignity could be maintained through posture and composure. The butter and cheese she'd crafted over the past week were carefully packed in the wagon, each crock labeled in her neat hand, small beginnings of something that could grow, if today went well, if questions could be deflected, if the wrong people weren't watching. Elijah loaded the wagon silently, his injured hand clearly paining him, though he refused to acknowledge it. Maggie had noticed this about him, how he absorbed discomfort without complaint, as if acknowledging pain might multiply it. In this, they were similar. "Ready?" he asked, offering his good hand to help her onto the seat. The unexpected courtesy surprised her, as did the strength in his grip as he assisted her. Most men avoided touching her altogether, as if her size might be contagious. She nodded her thanks and settled her skirts, the small leather journal tucked securely in her pocket. She never traveled without it. They chose Coopersville rather than Grant's Crossing, the extra miles worth the anonymity as they traveled. Maggie found herself studying Elijah's profile against the brightening sky. His features were sharp, all angles and weather-worn planes that spoke of years facing harsh elements. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking in his stoic endurance. "What will you tell people?" she asked finally. "About me? About this?" She gestured vaguely between them. Elijah considered, eyes on the road. "Truth, mostly. You brought the cow. Knowledge. I provided land. Shelter." He glanced at her. "Details aren't their business." The simplicity of his answer eased something in her chest. No elaborate lies to maintain. No performance of affection. Just practical facts about a practical arrangement. Coopersville proved busier than expected. The monthly market drawing farmers from outlying areas desperate to trade before winter. Maggie arranged their modest offerings on a borrowed table, while Elijah secured the wagon. Her butter, wrapped in cool cloths, was already attracting attention from passing women. "You're new," observed a gray-haired woman inspecting one of the crocks. "From Mason's place?" Maggie nodded, maintaining her composed expression. "Yes, we're diversifying into dairy." The technical language seemed to satisfy the woman, who selected a butter crock and paid without further questions. Others followed, each transaction building Maggie's confidence. By midday, half their goods were sold, the small pouch of coins a satisfying weight against her hip. The crisis came unexpectedly, as such things often did. Maggie was wrapping a cheese wheel for a customer when a familiar voice cut through the market noise, freezing her blood. "Interesting operation you've got here." Harrison Wells stood examining their table, his banker's suit out of place among the farmer's practical clothing. His eyes held the calculating assessment of a man tallying assets. "Mr. Wells," Elijah acknowledged stiffly, moving subtly closer to Maggie. "Mrs. Mason." Wells turned his attention to her. The courtesy title somehow transformed into something mockingly intimate. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Harrison Wells, territorial bank of Montana. His gaze traveled over her, lingering on her hands, her collar, her face. Unusual to see Wisconsin techniques applied in our territory. Very distinctive approach to dairy. The specific reference to Wisconsin sent alarm racing through her. Coincidence, or had inquiries been made? Family methods, she replied, keeping her voice steady. Passed down. Family, Wells repeated thoughtfully. Fascinating subject. Family connections, legal implications, inheritance matters. He smiled thinly. I'd love to hear more about your people sometime. Mrs. Mason, Wisconsin has such interesting probate laws. Before she could respond, Elijah stepped forward. We need to finish our business, Wells, unless you're buying. Wells chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. Another time. Then he tipped his hat. Good day, Mrs. Mason. I suspect we'll speak again soon. As he walked away, Maggie realized she'd been holding her breath. Elijah's expression was grim as he turned to her. He knows something, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed, her hand unconsciously touching the journal in her pocket. We should leave, now. They packed hurriedly, the remaining goods abandoned in favor of swift departure. The journey home felt endless, Maggie constantly scanning the road behind them while Elijah kept his rifle across his knees. Twice they spotted riders on parallel paths, keeping pace with their wagon. They're watching, not approaching, Elijah observed, his voice tight, looking for something. Or someone, Maggie thought, fear a cold knot in her stomach. When they finally reached the homestead, twilight was falling. The watchers had fallen back, but Maggie had no illusion they were truly gone. As Elijah tended the horse and cow, she moved through the cabin securing shutters, checking sight lines, old habits reasserting themselves. That night, after a tense, quiet meal, Maggie paused at her bedroom door. We should sell at a different town next time, she said, the first preference she'd expressed since arriving. Elijah studied her, questions evident in his eyes, but unspoken. Agreed, he said finally. Wherever you think best. The acknowledgement of her judgment, the simple deference to her preference, felt more significant than it should have. Maggie nodded her thanks and closed her door, the lock clicking into place from habit rather than fear of the man on the other side. It was the watchers outside who concerned her now, men who followed Harrison Wells's directions, seeking information about a woman who should have died in Wisconsin flames, a woman whose inheritance remained unclaimed, a woman whose husband would kill her twice if given the chance. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon as Elijah worked to reinforce the barn's north wall. His repaired hand still ached with each hammer strike, but necessity drove him forward. The air hung heavy with impending rain, not the gentle soaking the land desperately needed, but another violent storm brewing. The third that week. Inside the barn, Maggie murmured softly to the cow, now named Prosperity, in a rare moment of optimism, as she checked the animal's swollen udder for signs of mastitis. Her knowledge of livestock continued to impress him, each day revealing new skills she brought to their arrangement. Hailstorm coming, Elijah called, catching her attention as he secured another board. This roof won't hold against it. Maggie straightened, assessing the darkening sky through the open door. How long? Hour. Maybe less. He glanced at their work. Not enough time. She considered the barn's structure, then pointed to the southwest corner. If we move the hay bales to reinforce that section and use the canvas tarp for additional protection, we might create a secure enough shelter for Prosperity. They worked with urgent efficiency, moving heavy bales into a protective formation while thunder rumbled closer. Elijah climbed to the rafters to secure the tarp from above, while Maggie guided its placement from below. Their coordination had improved remarkably in just 2 weeks, each anticipating the other's needs without discussion. The first marble-sized hailstones struck just as they completed their preparations. Prosperity lowed nervously as they guided her into the reinforced corner, Maggie's calm voice soothing the animal. They barely made it under the protected section themselves before the storm hit in full fury. Hailstones, the size of eggs, hammering against the barn roof with terrifying force. "Will it hold?" Maggie shouted over the cacophony, her expression tense as she stroked Prosperity's flank. "It has to," Elijah replied, watching anxiously as the tarp strained against its moorings. A particularly violent gust tore through a gap in the wallboards, sending Maggie scrambling to plug the breach with a spare blanket. As she reached upward, her dress caught on a protruding nail and tore with a sharp ripping sound. She gasped, more in dismay than pain, quickly turning away from him, but not before Elijah glimpsed what the torn fabric revealed, a network of raised, angry scars covering her upper back and shoulder. The sight struck him like a physical blow. Burns, severe, extensive burns that could only have come from prolonged exposure to flame. Understanding dawned with sickening clarity, her flinching during thunderstorms, her fear of Wells's inquiries, her locked door. Maggie clutched the torn fabric closed, her face averted. "Don't," she said quietly, the word barely audible above the storm. Elijah removed his jacket and handed it to her, careful not to look directly at her. "For the cold," he said simply, offering dignity rather than questions. She accepted it with visible relief, shrugging it over her shoulders. For several minutes, they stood in awkward silence as the storm raged around them, the revelation hanging between them like smoke. "My husband," Maggie said finally, still not looking at him. "He wanted my inheritance. When I refused to sign it over, he—" Her voice faltered. "He locked me in our barn and set it ablaze. He believes I died there." The stark confession, delivered without emotion, chilled Elijah more than any display of grief would have. "Wells knows," he stated rather than asked. She nodded. "He's found something, a newspaper report perhaps, or made inquiries back east. The inheritance is substantial, enough to make a man search for a wife everyone believes is dead." "And the cow? Our arrangement?" "A desperate measure," she admitted. "I needed somewhere remote, someone with no connection to my past. The merchant said you were in dire circumstances, unlikely to ask questions." Her eyes finally met his. "I never meant to bring danger to your door." The hail began to subside, transitioning to heavy rain that drummed steadily on the roof. Prosperity nudged Maggie's hand, seeking reassurance, and she absently stroked the animal's nose. "What will you do?" Elijah asked, the question heavy with implication. Maggie's shoulders straightened beneath his jacket. "I should leave. Wells will make inquiries. Men will come looking. And go where?" The question emerged harsher than intended. "Alone? With winter coming?" She had no answer for that, the reality of her limited options evident in her silence. Elijah made a decision then, one born of something more complex than their original transaction. "This is your home now," he said firmly. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Surprise flickered across her face, followed by wariness. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger's troubles?" It was a fair question with no simple answer. Because she'd brought more than a cow to his failing farm. Because she worked without complaint and asked for little. Because she'd seen the trap Wells had laid in his account books when he'd been blind to it. Or perhaps because, for the first time in years, he wasn't merely surviving each day, but working toward something. "We made a bargain," he said finally. "I keep my word." That night, though the bedroom door remained locked, they spoke through it until late. Small stories of earlier lives exchanged like valuable currency. Elijah described his parents, the typhoid epidemic, the fiancée who'd abandoned him for better prospects. Maggie shared fragments of her father's dairy innovations, her childhood in Wisconsin, carefully edited to reveal little about her husband beyond his betrayal. The wooden barrier between them somehow made truth easier to offer. Confession simpler without the weight of direct gaze. With each exchange, the transaction that had brought them together transformed subtly into something more like alliance, still practical, still bounded, but stronger than the arrangement they'd begun with. The first tentative shoots of green appeared 6 weeks after Maggie's arrival. Tiny emerald blades pushing through soil everyone had declared dead. Elijah stood at the edge of the test plot where they'd implemented her father's irrigation technique, trenches dug in careful patterns to capture and channel what little moisture fell, mulched heavily with straw to prevent evaporation. A small triumph, but significant. "It's working," he said when Maggie joined him. Her arms laden with seedlings she'd started in improvised trays. She nodded, satisfaction visible in the slight upward curve of her mouth, not quite a smile, but closer than he'd yet seen. The soil just needed proper care, not more water. She knelt to examine the growth, fingers gently touching a fragile stem. "Another week, and we can expand to the south field." Elijah watched her work, still marveling at how her hands could be simultaneously strong enough for heavy labor, yet gentle enough for delicate tasks. Those same hands had transformed their meager stores into meals that sustained them, had turned prosperity's milk into butter and cheese that brought steady, if modest, income from towns far enough away to avoid Wells's scrutiny. The cow herself had thrived under Maggie's care, her coat glossy, her milk production exceeding Elijah's most optimistic expectations. This morning, Maggie had confirmed what she'd suspected for weeks. Prosperity was with calf. "Spring birth, if my calculations are correct," she'd announced over breakfast, the closest to excitement he'd heard in her voice. "By next summer, we could have the beginnings of a proper herd." The word had lingered between them, neither acknowledging how it transformed their arrangement into something more permanent than initially intended. 3 months had passed since their hasty wedding, the seasons shifting from late summer to autumn's golden haze. The locked bedroom door remained a boundary between them, but other barriers had dissolved through shared work and purpose. Their cautious celebration of new growth was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching horses. Elijah straightened, hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he kept nearby since their market day encounter with Wells. Maggie rose more slowly, dusting soil from her skirts, her expression closing like a shutter against light. "Stay behind me," Elijah said quietly, as 2 riders came into view, Harrison Wells and Sheriff Taylor, an unexpected and unwelcome combination of authority. "Mason," Wells called, false joviality in his greeting as they approached. "Thought we'd pay a neighborly visit. Sheriff's conducting property assessments for tax purposes." Sheriff Taylor nodded uncomfortably, clearly the junior partner in this expedition. Just routine. Mason, droughts hit county revenues hard. Convenient timing, Elijah replied coolly, noting how Wells's gaze had already fixed on Maggie. Mrs. Mason, Wells addressed her directly, dismounting with practiced grace. You're looking well. Wisconsin air must have agreed with you more than I heard. The deliberate reference hung in the air like gunpowder, volatile and threatening. Maggie's face remained impressively composed, though Elijah sensed her tension in the slight stiffening of her shoulders. Montana suits me better, she answered evenly. Fewer unpleasant associations. Wells smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Fascinating how associations follow us. Though, Sheriff, did I mention Mrs. Mason has quite the knowledge of dairy production, Wisconsin techniques. Specifically, reminds me of an article I read recently about a prominent dairy family there. Tragic story. Sheriff Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. We should continue the assessment. Wells. Other properties to visit before sundown. Of course, Wells gestured expansively. Just a quick look at the improvements for the tax rolls. They had no choice but to allow the inspection. Wells moved through the property with proprietary interest, noting the new irrigation system, the reinforced barn, the healthy cow. His questions probed for weaknesses in their finances, in their story, in the careful life they were constructing. Remarkable recovery for a farm everyone considered doomed, he observed as they completed the circuit. Almost miraculous how quickly fortunes change with the right investment. His gaze lingered meaningfully on Maggie. I'd be interested to know more about your family's methods. Mrs. Mason, perhaps you have documentation, records from your father's farm. Maggie's hand moved unconsciously toward her pocket where the leather journal remained her constant companion. Family knowledge, she replied. Nothing that would interest a banker. You'd be surprised what interests me, Wells countered smoothly. Especially matters of provenance and identity. The implied threat couldn't have been clearer. As the unwelcome visitors finally departed, Elijah watched the rigid set of Maggie's back, the careful control with which she maintained composure until they were safely out of sight. Only then did she allow herself to tremble. One hand braced against the barn door for support. He knows, she whispered. Not everything, but enough to be dangerous. Elijah moved to her side, close but not touching, respecting the space she still needed. What can he prove? Nothing yet, she said, straightening with visible effort. But he's seeking proof, making inquiries back east. The implications hung heavily between them. If Wells contacted her husband, if he provided evidence of her survival and location, everything they'd built would be threatened, not just their improving farm, but Maggie's life itself. That evening, after a quiet meal, Elijah found Maggie standing by Prosperity's stall, her hand resting on the cow's flank, her expression distant with worry. If someone came looking for me, she asked softly, would you help? The question carried the weight of fear she rarely displayed. Vulnerability she seldom revealed. Elijah considered his answer carefully, knowing its importance transcended their practical arrangement. Yes, he said simply. Whatever comes, you're not alone in this anymore. The words felt like a vow more binding than the hasty ceremony that had legally joined them. Maggie's eyes met his, searching for truth or deception, finding only steady resolve. Something shifted between them then, a recognition that their transaction had evolved into a partnership neither had anticipated, but both now valued beyond its practical benefits. That night, though the bedroom door remained locked as always, the barrier felt less like protection and more like a final hesitation before a threshold that, once crossed, would irrevocably change everything between them. Elijah worked through the early morning hours, the rhythmic swing of his hammer punctuating dawn's silence. The small outbuilding taking shape behind the barn had been his secret project for 2 weeks. Materials salvaged from abandoned properties with Sheriff Taylor's tacit permission. With each beam secured, each wall raised. His anticipation grew, not for the structure itself, but for Maggie's reaction to its purpose inside the cabin. Maggie kneaded dough with practiced motions, her thoughts elsewhere. 4 months had passed since her arrival, the arrangement with Elijah evolving in ways neither had anticipated. The growing farm, while still modest, showed promising signs of recovery. Prosperity's pregnancy progressed well. The small green patches expanded weekly. Yet Harrison Wells' veiled threats cast long shadows over their fragile security. The sound of hammering stopped abruptly. Through the window, she watched Elijah step back to assess his work, satisfaction evident in his posture. He'd been secretive about this project, deflecting her questions with uncharacteristic evasiveness. Curiosity tugged at her as she shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise. Midday found her hanging laundry when Elijah approached, his expression unreadable except for a certain tension around his eyes, not worry, but something closer to anticipation. "Have a minute?" he asked, wiping dust from his hands. "Want to show you something?" Maggie nodded, following him toward the new structure. As they rounded the barn, she saw it clearly for the first time, a small but sturdy outbuilding with a workbench visible through the open door, shelves lining the walls, and a window positioned to catch northern light. "It's a cheese-making shed," Elijah explained, watching her face carefully. "Proper ventilation, consistent temperature, better than working in the kitchen." Maggie stood motionless, absorbing the meaning behind the simple structure. He'd built this specifically for her work, designed it for her comfort and efficiency. Not because their arrangement required it, but because he'd noticed what would make her life easier. The gesture struck deeper than any words could have. "It's perfect," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand touching his arm in momentary gratitude. The contact was brief but electric, both startled at the connection, the first voluntary touch since their transaction began. Maggie withdrew her hand quickly, but the sensation lingered, a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. "Thank you," she added, eyes dropping to hide whatever might be visible in them. Elijah nodded, clearly affected, but equally determined to maintain their careful equilibrium. "Practical investments, he said, reverting to their familiar language of utility. "Better cheese means better prices." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a boundary crossed that couldn't be re-established. They spent the afternoon moving her cheese-making equipment into the new space, working together with the synchronicity they'd developed, now complicated by a new awareness of each other. Later, as dusk approached, Maggie found herself humming softly as she worked in her new shed. A Wisconsin folk song her mother had sung while churning butter. The familiar melody brought comfort, a connection to a past that wasn't entirely painful. She hadn't realized Elijah stood in the doorway until she turned and found him watching, an unguarded expression of appreciation quickly masked. "Didn't know you sang," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Maggie felt color rise in her cheeks. "Habit from childhood. My mother believed music improved the milk's quality." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Does it?" "No," she admitted, returning the almost smile. But it improves the churning. This small exchange of personal history, trivial as it seemed, represented another step away from their original transaction toward something neither could yet name. Their tentative moment was shattered by Prosperity's alarmed lowing from the barn, followed by a thrashing sound. They rushed toward the noise, Elijah reaching the barn door first. Inside, Prosperity backed frantically against her stall as a large rattlesnake coiled near the water trough, its warning rattle filling the enclosed space. "Get back," Elijah ordered, reaching for the pitchfork leaning against the wall. But Maggie had already grabbed a shovel. Moving forward with determined steps, the snake struck toward her, missing by inches. Before it could recoil, Elijah drove the pitchfork down, pinning it just behind the head, with a swift motion. Maggie's shovel severed the reptile's head, ending the threat to their valuable cow. The danger passed in seconds, leaving them breathless with fading adrenaline. Prosperity still trembled in her stall as Maggie moved to soothe her, checking anxiously for any signs of a bite. "She's unharmed," she reported, relief evident in her voice. But how did a snake get in? The barn was secured. Elijah examined the dead reptile with growing suspicion. Rattlers don't typically come this close to buildings this time of year. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Someone could have placed it here. The implication hung between them. Another warning. Another threat. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she continued stroking Prosperity's flank. The cow represented not just their livelihood, but the foundation of their arrangement. The beginning of everything they'd built together. "Wells?" she asked, though they both knew the answer. "Or someone working for him," Elijah confirmed grimly. "He's growing impatient." Without conscious thought, Maggie stepped closer to Elijah, seeking the security of proximity. He moved toward her simultaneously, protective instinct overriding their usual careful distance. When his arms encircled her, the embrace felt both shocking and inevitable, awkward yet necessary. Neither pulled away immediately, finding unexpected comfort in the contact they'd so carefully avoided. When they finally separated, something fundamental had changed. The transaction that had brought them together, the arrangement that had evolved into partnership, all of it had transformed into something far more complicated and potentially dangerous. That night, Maggie's hand hesitated at the bedroom door, the familiar ritual of locking herself away suddenly feeling more like isolation than protection. After a long moment, she left the door unlocked, though neither acknowledged this change as Elijah settled onto the porch as usual. The door stood unlocked, but neither crossed the threshold that night. Some barriers fell more slowly than others, and some permissions needed more than an open door to grant. Yet the meaning was clear to both. Whatever dangers approached, they would face them together rather than separately, their fates now inextricably linked by more than a cow and a hasty ceremony. Silas Jenkins's wagon appeared on the horizon a month earlier than his usual circuit, the unexpected sight drawing both Elijah and Maggie from their respective tasks. The traveling merchant's off-schedule arrival could mean many things, but experience had taught them to expect complications rather than blessings. Mason Jenkins called as he approached, his typically jovial manner subdued. "Got some information might interest you and the missus." They met him at the property edge, maintaining cautious distance until certain of his intentions. Jenkins had facilitated their arrangement, but remained an unknown factor in the increasingly complex situation surrounding them. "Didn't expect you till spring," Elijah commented, helping the older man down from his wagon. Jenkins nodded grimly. "Wasn't planning to swing this way, but figured you ought to see these." He reached into his coat, withdrawing several folded newspapers. "Been collecting these as I traveled. Notice arrived in Helena last week from Wisconsin authorities, looking for information about a missing woman." Maggie's face remained impressively composed as she accepted the papers, though Elijah noted the slight tremor in her hands. The topmost newspaper featured a small article circled in pencil: "Wilkes' inheritance remains unclaimed after tragic fire." A smaller Wisconsin paper carried a notice seeking information about Margaret Wilkes, presumably deceased, but whose body was never conclusively identified. "Thought it might concern you," Jenkins said carefully, his eyes moving between them. "Given the circumstances of your arrangement." "Why bring this to us?" Elijah asked, tension evident in his stance. Could have taken it to Wells. Reward money mentioned there. Jenkins removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. "Could have," he agreed, "but I make my living on trust. Mason, break that. I've got nothing." He glanced at Maggie. "Besides, I've seen what happens when folks get desperate. Made your choice for your reasons. Ma'am, not my place to upend that." Maggie studied the merchant with new assessment. "Thank you," she said simply. "Wells been asking questions up and down the territory," Jenkins continued, "showing a photograph to anyone who'll look, offering good money for information." He hesitated. "And he's not alone in his inquiries." "What do you mean?" Elijah asked sharply. "Man arrived in Helena 3 days ago. Wisconsin accent, expensive clothes, asking about a woman matching the missus's description." Jenkins looked apologetic. "Said he was her brother. Searching for her after learning she might have survived the fire. But his eyes—" The merchant shook his head. "Weren't a brother's eyes, if you take my meaning." Ice formed in Maggie's stomach. Edward. It could only be Edward. Following the trail of inquiries Wells had undoubtedly initiated. The moment she had dreaded since fleeing Wisconsin had arrived with crushing inevitability. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite her internal panic. "Before he connects the dots? Week, maybe less." Jenkins estimated. Man's methodical, working his way through settlements along the stage routes. After Jenkins departed with supplies they could ill afford to share, but offered as thanks for his warning. Maggie and Elijah retreated to the cabin. The newspapers lay spread across the table between them, damning evidence of a past rapidly catching up to their precarious present. "I need to tell you everything," Maggie said finally, reaching for the leather journal she guarded so carefully, "before decisions are made." She opened the book, revealing not just the farming notes Elijah had glimpsed before, but legal documents carefully pressed between pages, property deeds, banking drafts, her father's will with its specific provisions. "My father was William Wilkes, one of Wisconsin's most successful dairy farmers," she began, the words coming more easily now that concealment was futile. "He developed breeding techniques and feeding methods that doubled production on our lands. When he fell ill, I managed everything, the farm, the accounts, the business." Her fingers traced a deed bearing her name. "He knew Edward coveted the land and money. Arranged the inheritance carefully, trusts that couldn't be touched by a husband, properties that remained in my name regardless of marriage laws." She looked up, meeting Elijah's eyes directly. "Edward married me for what he thought he could take. When legal methods failed him, he turned to more direct measures." "The fire," Elijah said quietly. Maggie nodded, one hand unconsciously rising to the high collar that concealed the worst of her scars. "He locked me in our barn, thinking I was alone, but Hannah, our housemaid, had followed him, suspicious of his behavior. She pulled me out through a back window as the roof collapsed. Her voice remained clinically detached, as if recounting someone else's tragedy. Everyone believed I died there. It was safer that way while I healed. And the inheritance remains in trust, awaiting proof of my survival or confirmation of my death. Nearly $50,000, plus the farm properties. She closed the journal carefully. Enough to make a man hunt across territories for a wife everyone believes is Ash. Elijah absorbed this information with the measured consideration that characterized him. "What will you do?" he asked finally. "What can I do?" Despair tinged her response. "If I claim the inheritance, Edward will know I'm alive. If I don't, Wells will inform him anyway, hoping for reward or partnership in whatever scheme he's devised." "We could run," Elijah suggested, though his tone indicated how little he favored that option. "Sell everything, head further west." "And live forever, looking over our shoulders?" Maggie shook her head. "I've done that. It's no life." She straightened, decision crystallizing. "We face this directly, establish my legal status with the territorial judge before Edward arrives. With proper documentation, his claims over me and the inheritance become invalid." The deliberate "we" hung between them, neither acknowledging how completely their separate predicaments had merged into shared purpose. Elijah reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "Together, then," he agreed. Their moment of resolution was interrupted by Prosperity's distressed lowing from the barn. They rushed outside to find the cow backing frantically from her water trough, refusing to drink. Elijah dipped a finger in the water, then jerked it back, the acrid smell confirming his suspicion. "Poisoned," he said grimly, overturning the trough with a violent motion. "Not enough to kill immediately, but over time." The message couldn't have been clearer. Their time was running out. Someone, Wells or agents working for him, had escalated from threats to direct action against their livelihood. That night, preparing for their journey to the territorial court, they finally acknowledged the feelings growing between them, though they agreed any real future must wait until Maggie was legally free, if they survived that long. As Elijah gathered supplies and Maggie secured her documentation, the stakes of their confrontation crystallized with terrible clarity. This was no longer about a transaction between desperate strangers, a cow exchanged for shelter, a marriage of pure convenience. It had become a battle for something neither had expected to find in their practical arrangement, a partnership worth defending, possibly even a future worth the dangers they now faced together. The territorial courthouse in Helena stood as a monument to aspirational permanence, stone and timber where most buildings remained rough-hewn wood. Its sturdy construction promising the endurance of law in a land still testing the boundaries of civilization. Maggie clutched her leather journal as they climbed the steps, each document inside meticulously prepared for this moment of truth. 3 days of hard travel had brought them here, leaving Prosperity in a neighbor's reluctant care. The journey had been tense, both scanning constantly for pursuit, sleeping in shifts when they stopped. Now, as the courthouse doors loomed before them, Maggie found herself hesitating. "Ready?" Elijah asked quietly, his steady presence beside her the only certainty in this precarious gamble. Before she could respond, a familiar voice called from behind them. "Mrs. Mason? What a remarkable coincidence." Harrison Wells approached, with the practiced smile of a predator who no longer needed to conceal his intentions. Beside him walked a tall, well-dressed man whose features Maggie had once known as intimately as her own, Edward Parker. his handsome face showing no surprise at finding his supposedly dead wife on distant courthouse steps. "No coincidence at all, I'd say," Edward commented smoothly, his Wisconsin accent pronounced against Wells' Western drawl. Margaret always was predictable in her desperate measures. The sound of his voice froze Maggie where she stood, memories of flame and terror washing over her with paralyzing force. Elijah shifted slightly, positioning himself between her and the approaching men. Mr. Parker was most interested to learn his grieving period might have been unnecessary, Wells continued, enjoying his orchestrated confrontation. Imagine his shock at discovering his beloved wife not only survived that tragic fire, but entered into another marriage without bothering to dissolve her first. Edward's eyes traveled over Maggie with cold assessment. Quite the elaborate deception. "Margaret, though I see Montana hasn't improved your appearance." His gaze shifted to Elijah. "I assume this arrangement was motivated by desperation rather than affection. I can't imagine any other explanation." The casual cruelty, so familiar from years of marriage, sparked something in Maggie that fear had temporarily extinguished. Rage, clean and clarifying. She straightened, stepping forward rather than remaining in Elijah's protective shadow. "We have business with the judge," she said, her voice steadier than she had thought possible, "concerning legal documentation of my survival and rightful inheritance." Edward's smile tightened. "The judge already has documentation, our marriage certificate, property records showing my clear interest in the Wilkes estate, and sworn statements regarding your unstable behavior prior to the unfortunate accident." "Accident?" Elijah's voice carried dangerous quiet. Strange word for attempted murder. "Careful with such accusations," Edward replied smoothly. "My wife suffered delusions before her disappearance. Her mental state, combined with her physical limitations, created unfortunate fantasies of persecution." Wells watched this exchange with undisguised satisfaction. "The territorial judge is currently reviewing Mr. Parker's petition for declaration of legal custody over his wife's person and property. Given her evident mental confusion and bigamous actions, the trap was more complete than Maggie had anticipated." Edward had arrived prepared not just to claim her survival, but to establish her as mentally incompetent, a strategy that would give him control of everything while removing her ability to fight back. One look at the confidence in his eyes told her he had witnesses prepared to testify, documentation carefully crafted, perhaps even a doctor ready to declare her unfit. "Judge Crawford will see you now." The clerk's announcement interrupted the tense standoff. Inside the judge's chambers, the legal battle unfolded with clinical precision. Edward presented his case first, the concerned husband, devastated by his wife's apparent death, now shocked to discover her alive but clearly unwell, having fled to enter a bigamous marriage under false pretenses. When Maggie's turn came, she found her voice despite Edward's intimidating presence. She presented her father's journal with its careful documentation, the legal trusts established specifically to protect her from Edward's control, and her own account of the fire's deliberate setting. Judge Crawford, a weathered man whose eyes suggested he'd heard every variety of human deception, examined each document carefully. "These provisions are unusually specific," he noted, reviewing William Wilkes' will. "Your father anticipated potential difficulties in your marriage?" "He saw Edward clearly when I could not," Maggie replied, strength growing with each word. "The inheritance was structured to remain mine regardless of marriage laws. Edward discovered this only after our wedding." The judge turned to Elijah. "And your role in this complicated situation, Mr. Mason?" "We married by agreement," Elijah stated simply. "Her knowledge for my protection later learned the full circumstances." His eyes met Maggie's briefly. "Would make the same choice knowing everything." The judge considered this, then addressed Edward directly. "Mr. Parker, these documents raise significant questions about your petition. The inheritance specifications appear legally binding, and the accusations of attempted murder, while unproven, cannot be dismissed without investigation." Edward's composed facade cracked slightly. "My wife is clearly delusional, Your Honor. These fabrications—" "I have burns covering 20% of my body," Maggie interrupted, her hands moving to the high collar of her dress. "Would you like to see Edward's handiwork, Your Honor?" The judge raised his hand. "That won't be necessary. Mrs. Wilkes, or Mason, your status requires further legal consideration." He gathered the documents carefully. "I'll review everything presented and render a preliminary decision tomorrow morning. Until then, both parties will refrain from contact." Outside the courthouse, Wells waited with poorly concealed impatience. "The outcome is inevitable," he told Edward loudly enough for Maggie and Elijah to hear. "Even with delay, possession is 9/10 of the law. She'll be returning to Wisconsin under your supervision by week's end." The calculated statement struck its intended target. As Elijah and Maggie moved toward their wagon, Edward followed, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Did you really think you could escape me, Margaret, that I'd allow you to take what's rightfully mine?" His handsome features twisted with contempt. "You'll return to Wisconsin. The judge will see reason. Or accidents can happen to more than Barnes." The threat hung in the air between them as they reached the street. What happened next occurred with bewildering speed, Edward lunging suddenly, gripping Maggie's arm with bruising force. Wells signaling to men waiting nearby. Elijah's swift intervention met with a blow that sent him staggering. "You're coming with me now," Edward hissed, dragging Maggie toward a waiting carriage. "We'll resolve this privately." Terror paralyzed her momentarily, the familiar pattern of violence and control reasserting itself. Then something new emerged, not just fear, but fury fed by months of building strength and purpose. She wrenched away with unexpected force, her substantial frame an advantage rather than liability as Edward struggled to maintain his grip. The confrontation escalated rapidly. Wells' hired men surrounded Elijah, who fought with grim determination despite being outnumbered. Edward, enraged by Maggie's resistance, struck her across the face with calculated precision, a blow he'd delivered countless times during their marriage. But Maggie was no longer the cowed wife who had endured such treatment in silent shame. As Edward reached for her again, she drove her knee upward with all her considerable strength, dropping him to the ground with a howl of pain. The small victory was short-lived as Wells himself moved to restrain her, his banker's hands surprisingly strong. The chaotic struggle drew attention from passers-by and eventually the sheriff, who waded into the fray with reluctant authority. As the confrontation paused under official intervention, Edward regained his feet, his face contorted with humiliation and rage. With calculated malice, he struck a match and held it near Maggie's face. "Still afraid of fire, Margaret?" Some fears never fade. The small flame triggered memories of suffocating smoke, searing pain, collapsing timbers. But instead of cowering, Maggie found herself moving forward rather than back, staring directly into the flame that had haunted her nightmares. "I walked through your fire once and survived," she said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The sheriff's intervention separated them before Edward could respond. But the shift in power was palpable. As Elijah reached her side, bloodied but unbowed, Maggie felt something settle within her, not just anger or defiance, but a calm certainty that regardless of tomorrow's legal decision, she had already claimed the most important victory. That night, in the modest room they'd rented above Helena's quieter saloon, Elijah carefully tended the bruise darkening Maggie's cheekbone, his touch gentle despite his own injuries. "You fought well," he said, simple admiration in his voice where she had expected pity. "So did you," she replied, examining the cut above his eye with professional attention, though the odds were hardly fair. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Never are. As she cleaned his wounds, Maggie found herself studying the face that had become so familiar over months of shared work and purpose, the sharp angles softened now by something warmer than mere partnership, the steady eyes that saw her as valuable rather than merely useful. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "thank you for fighting beside me, for seeing me as worth the battle." Elijah's hand caught hers, stilling her ministrations. "Not beside you," he corrected gently. "With you." The distinction might have seemed trivial to others, but Maggie understood its significance, not protector and protected, but equals facing adversity together. In that moment, the transaction that had brought them together, the arrangement that had evolved into alliance, transformed finally into something neither had sought but both now recognized as worth any risk. "With you," she agreed, the words carrying the weight of promise rather than mere acknowledgement. As Edward Parker seethed in his hotel room and Harrison Wells plotted further machinations, Maggie and Elijah found unexpected peace in their uncertain circumstances, not because victory was assured, but because they had already won what mattered most, the freedom to choose their own path forward, together. 3 months after the confrontation in Helena, Elijah stood on his porch surveying land that now barely resembled the dying homestead of the previous summer. Maggie's irrigation techniques had transformed parched earth into promising soil. Winter wheat already showing green promise in careful rows. The barn, once barely standing, now housed not only Prosperity and her healthy heifer calf, but 2 additional milk cows purchased with part of Maggie's inheritance. The inheritance, still difficult to fully comprehend in its magnitude. Judge Crawford's ruling had come as a shock to everyone except perhaps the judge himself. After reviewing all documentation and hearing testimonies, including the unexpected appearance of Hannah, Maggie's former housemaid, who had traveled from Wisconsin with evidence of Edward's misdeeds, Crawford had not only affirmed Maggie's legal right to her father's estate, but initiated criminal proceedings against Edward for attempted murder. Wells' involvement had unraveled spectacularly when the judge discovered his financial ties to Edward and his pattern of land acquisition through questionable foreclosures. The banker now faced his own legal troubles, his reputation in tatters as investigations expanded to include numerous properties throughout the territory. The cabin door opened behind Elijah, and he turned to watch Maggie emerge with a tray of lemonade. Her movements confident in spaces she now fully claimed as her own. The bruise on her cheek had faded weeks ago, but something more significant remained, a certainty in her posture, a directness in her gaze that spoke of battles fought and identity reclaimed. "The Richardsons just left," she said, setting the tray on the small table they'd recently added to the porch. "They want 10 wheels of the sage cheese for their daughter's wedding next month." Elijah accepted the glass she offered. their fingers brushing in a contact now comfortable rather than startling. "Good price?" "Better than good," she replied with satisfaction. And they asked about the irrigation system. John thinks it might work on their south acreage. This had become their new normal. Neighboring farmers who once whispered mockingly about their unusual arrangement now sought their advice, their innovations, their products. The fat stranger and the desperate rancher had transformed into respected community members whose partnership offered a model for surviving harsh conditions. "Letter came while you were with the cattle," Maggie added, drawing an envelope from her pocket. "From the Wisconsin bank. The last of the property transfers are complete." Elijah nodded, still adjusting to their altered circumstances. The money itself meant little to him beyond security, but its significance to Maggie's freedom mattered tremendously. With her inheritance secured and Edward awaiting trial in Wisconsin, the past no longer loomed as a constant threat. "Good," he said simply. Then, with careful neutrality, "Have you decided about the Wisconsin offer?" The question had hovered between them for weeks, an opportunity to reclaim her father's original farm property, now available for purchase. It represented a chance to return triumphantly to the world that had believed her dead, to rebuild her family's legacy on its original foundation. Maggie considered her answer. Looking out over the Montana landscape that had initially represented mere refuge, but now held deeper meaning. "I have," she said finally. "I'm declining." Elijah kept his expression neutral despite the relief that washed through him. "You're certain?" "It's your birthright." "This is my chosen right," she corrected, gesturing toward their flourishing homestead. "What we've built here matters more than reclaiming what was taken." The "we" no longer required qualification or explanation. In the months since Helena, their relationship had evolved beyond transaction or even partnership into something neither named directly, but both acknowledged through 1,000 daily choices, a shared bedroom where the door remained permanently open, decisions made jointly rather than separately, a future planned together rather than merely alongside each other. The sound of approaching wagons interrupted their moment of quiet understanding. Saturday visitors had become routine as their reputation spread, neighbors seeking advice, merchants interested in their expanding dairy production. Occasionally, even tourists passing through who had heard about the innovative farming methods at the Mason place. Today's visitors included the Hendersons from the neighboring property, the Wilsons whose wheat farm had adopted their irrigation system, and several families Elijah recognized from Coopersville's market. What surprised him was their arrival together, clearly planned rather than coincidental. "What's all this?" he asked as the procession approached. Mrs. Henderson, never one to waste words, answered directly. "Harvest dinner. You're hosting." Maggie's eyebrows rose. "We are?" "Community decided," Mr. Wilson explained, his wagon revealing covered dishes and baskets. "First successful growing season in 3 years deserves celebration. Your methods saved half the farms in the county. Seems fitting to gather where it started." What followed was organized chaos as tables appeared from wagons. Food was arranged on hastily assembled platforms. Children scattered to explore the property under strict instructions not to disturb the new plantings. Elijah found himself directed to provide tours of the irrigation system, while Maggie's expertise was demanded regarding both dairy production and the burn-resistant barn design they'd implemented after her experiences. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Elijah observed Maggie among their guests, noting how she moved with comfortable authority through conversations, her size now registering as abundance rather than flaw in a community where survival depended on substance rather than appearance. No one whispered behind hands about the fat stranger anymore. They listened attentively to the knowledgeable woman whose methods had helped them weather devastation. The formal dinner, spread across tables arranged in the clearing beside their home, featured Maggie's cheeses prominently alongside contributions from every attending family. A community feast symbolizing resilience and cooperation rather than mere celebration. When Mr. Henderson stood to offer thanks, he raised his glass toward Elijah and Maggie with simple sincerity. "To the Masons," he said, "who showed us that even in the hardest times, growth is possible with the right knowledge and partnership." The toast carried meaning beyond farming techniques. As glasses raised around them, Elijah's hand found Maggie's beneath the table, their fingers interlacing in private acknowledgement of how completely their transaction had transformed into genuine union. Later, as the last wagons departed and twilight settled over their land, they stood together on the porch, watching the horizon turn crimson and gold. The beauty of Montana's vast sky had initially seemed indifferent to Elijah's struggles, but now appeared to celebrate their hard-won victories. "Did you ever imagine this?" Maggie asked, gesturing toward their flourishing property. "When Jenkins first proposed his peculiar situation?" Elijah considered the question honestly. "Imagined survival," he admitted. "Maybe some improvement. Not this." His arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "Not us." The simple truth hung between them, how a desperate bargain had yielded unexpected harvest, how two people seeking mere existence had discovered reasons to truly live. Maggie turned within his embrace, her eyes meeting his with the directness that had become her nature. "I locked my door that first night because I believed safety meant isolation," she said quietly. "I was wrong." "We both were," Elijah acknowledged, remembering his own relief at that locked door, his belief that emotional distance offered protection. As darkness gathered around them, Elijah Mason realized he had stopped merely surviving months ago. Somewhere between desperate transaction and this moment of completion, he had found something worth living for instead. Maggie's hand found his, fingers interlacing with familiar strength as she led him inside, through the doorway that now stood permanently open between them. The bedroom that had once represented boundary and separation now symbolized their shared future. Not just the physical space, but the trust it represented, the vulnerability they now offered freely rather than guarded fiercely. The past with its flames and droughts could never be forgotten. But neither would it define the future they continued to build together. A future as promising as their winter wheat, pushing through once barren ground toward spring's certain renewal.